This is a video about the YouTuber Cosmic Skeptic, but I want to touch on other issues as well. So it will be roughly divided into three sections. In this first part, I want to talk about what are the different atheist movements online, because there are really only three. Uh, the first movement that you can identify is the New Atheists. So these are guys who they have contrarian perspectives sometimes. They're willing to offend a lot. However, they care a lot about being professionals. They're adults. They mostly came to fame by writing a series of books. I'm referring to the Four Horsemen, who wrote four books that came out about the same time, so it was considered a bit of a movement. And so these figures were they're professional. They can appear on TV, so it's not a purely online thing, and they can kind of represent atheism in some capacity where you care about your image. The next group I want to talk about is what I'll call the Pre-Skeptics. And I call the Pre-Skeptics because they precede the Skeptics, and the Skeptics was at one time the name for basically anti-SJWs on YouTube. So in a lot of atheist movements, there was conflict between left wing causes and the fact that a lot of them, by virtue of the fact that they kind of have a blunt demeanor and not afraid of offending people, they end up being anti SJWs, as they call themselves, or were called. So, two figures that come to mind that really led this were TJ Kirk and Thunderfoot. Now, the third movement of atheists that came after the pre-skeptics. After the pre-skeptics, they kind of got bored. They talked about other things or just didn't talk about politics that much. I'm going to call them the rationalists, not to be confused with the rationalists at like Slate Star Codex and you know Cohen. Those less wrong rationalists. These are the atheist rationalists. So I actually like some of these guys, kind of. The first guy is Rationality Rules, then Genetically Modified Skeptic. I don't like him that much. And the third guy who I want to talk about is Cosmic Skeptic. And so there's a big difference in style between the pre-skeptics and the rationalists. The rationalists care more about philosophy. The pre-skeptics did sometimes kind of pretend to go over philosophical arguments, but it was more about like unpolished videos, very raw, very connect with the audience kind of thing. A lot of takedown videos, the type of thing where you don't care so much about your image. Whereas the rationalists, they are not as adult as the new atheists, but they care more about being polished and being kind of having a good reputation, you could say. And they care a lot about having exactly the philosophical rigor of their views. And so both the pre-skeptics and the rationalists, they ended up having issues with uh, conflict between the anti-SJWs and the SJWs. But the rationalists were calmer. The pre-skeptics were very angry. Rationalists took pride in their content. And something I've always kind of felt about people who are, you could say, like professional atheists online, because that is kind of a genre. I have always kind of wondered how you end up in that position. And I mean by that is, I can understand being an atheist. I mean, you can have whatever beliefs you want, you can be an atheist. However, it does seem a little strange to me that you would base your entire identity on being an atheist, because, as they claim themselves, atheism is not really an identity, it's just a lack of identity. So why would you base your whole online identity on an identity that you don't have? I mean, why would you be so obsessed with it, right? That's always kind of how I felt. And um, so it seems it's kind of pathological to me, because if you came from like a Christian family and you had to suffer like abuse from some extreme like Jehovah's Witnesses or something like that, then yeah, of course it will be a part of your identity. But if you did not grow up in a Christian household at all and Christianity is just something theoretical to you, well, it might be interesting for a while to make those philosophical arguments and feel superior about you're right and they're wrong. But I think that's kind of a shallow way to live, is just to look at people who you think are wrong and describe how they're wrong all day. Eventually, you'll get bored. And this is indeed what the pre-skeptics did. They got bored. And they talked about other stuff. And that's inevitable for any movement that it defines itself by what it's not. It will eventually either become extreme or just get bored and stop talking about it. Because it's just a lack of identity. And if you didn't come from a Christian household and you never actually like suffered, you could describe it based on religion, isn't it just kind of intellectual masturbation, which is fine, but on the other hand, like it does seem kind of a bad way to go about your identity. However, I guess online identity is different than real identity, so maybe they're not actually thinking about religion that much in their daily lives. But how I think about it is, even if you believe that there are a billion people who are just wrong because of their religious views, which inevitably you probably do believe, no matter what your religious views, you shouldn't spend a lot of time thinking about, wow, large swaths of humanity have different opinions than me, because it's just something, to be honest, that I kind of take for granted, that a lot of people will disagree with me, like large swaths of humanity. And that I don't try to think, okay, how can I make all 7 billion people come over to my way of thinking? I have to accept, okay, let me find the enclave that happens to share enough sensibilities with me that I can get along with them, and move there and just engage with those people. So that is the 3 atheist movements as I define it, and some of my thoughts about them. Now, the topic of this video is Cosmic Skeptic, right? The YouTube channel. And he has defined himself based on basically 2 views over his YouTube career. The first view was being anti-religious. It was being atheist. But as I went over above, basically most people who are vocal atheists, they eventually get bored with it and have to talk about something else, or they just become really radical. There are a few exceptions, of course, but I think that's a general issue. So he eventually moved on to talking about something else recently. He talked about veganism. So now he's a very vocal veganism proponent. Like, most of the videos he makes probably are about that topic. And so those are his beliefs. However, I don't just in this video want to talk about his beliefs. I actually want to talk more about him, and you might... Okay, here, let me be honest. I want to talk about him in terms of some aspects of how he thinks. That is, his kind of philosophical temperament. And you might look down on that as character assassination, mudslinging, tone attacks, ad hominem. Isn't that not a philosophically justified way to talk about a person? However, I will justify later in this video why I think it's important to go down that route and mention it. I think I will justify later after I've gone over describing, and I think in a way that you'll find very interesting his temperament, then I will, I think, convincingly justify why I disagree with it. Or rather, why I think it's worthwhile to talk about his temperament, or what he draws as the basis of his philosophical views, because it will be more a philosophical discussion, if anything, than discussion of temperament. I think that's the wrong word here. And I want to say something up front, however. I don't necessarily, in fact, I will say up front, I don't disagree with any of the, with most of the aspects that I will describe below. I actually agree with a lot of how he goes about things. So pointing these things out is not to criticize him. It will be, if anything, to praise him, or just talk about it neutrally, and you can draw your own opinions about whether it's good or bad. And in fact, many of these things might be good. But anyway, I think that his mindset is described by four things. The first is interrogative precepts. And what I mean by that is he is not someone who would ever think you should just believe something because your parents told it to you, or maybe even you should not believe something because your teachers told you something, or at least you should maybe accept it at first, but only truly believe it when you interrogate it. And he would also not believe that it's a good idea to believe something just because an institution tells it to you, or because it's tradition. Like, you shouldn't look at an aspect of society and say, okay, society's been doing this for a long time, it's part of tradition, so we should probably give some trust to it. He might give some leeway to that. However, he would ultimately want to say, um, well, in order to truly believe something, you have to understand it yourself. But ultimately, that cancels out the former position, because if that's the case, if for any tradition, if it can't be justified, then it should be abandoned, and if it can be justified according to philosophical grounds or evidentiary grounds, then why not just justify it on evidentiary grounds? What's the point of even having it be a tradition in the first place? Just have it be a thing that people know and people are taught because it's a fact about the world. In other words, we shouldn't give basically any credence to tradition. And so interrogative precepts is the idea that beliefs should come from logical introspection or study. That is, everything you believe, you should believe because you were persuaded of it or read an argument about it that persuaded you to that position or provided sufficient evidence. So you can go into scientific research. But I think more prescient to what I want to talk about is you can be persuaded of things because you read philosophy, and you can open up philosophy books and you can read the philosophy books, and then you can form your philosophical opinions in that way. Okay, the next item I want to talk about is applied philosophy. And this is the idea that philosophy isn't necessarily just mental masturbation. I mean, there are some things that can seem pretty detached from reality, like epistemology, right? But when you get into metaphysics and semiotics and that sort of thing, then at a certain point you have to say, well, is this really, what's the point? It doesn't even connect with reality. I don't just do philosophy for masturbation. Philosophy should be something that teaches you something about how you should act or how the world is. Beliefs should compel actions, or at least tell you something about the world that could theoretically, by virtue of the fact that you don't know what situation you will find yourself in, anything you know about the world could compel your actions theoretically. So this is the idea that philosophy should be actionable or practical or language that connects with reality. The third thing, contrarianism. So this is the idea that you do not mind thinking that most people disagree with you about something. In fact, to the extent that you think other people disagree with you about something, then in fact it emboldens your belief even stronger. And in fact, in some sense, this makes sense, because if you believe something that other people do not believe, then it's a way to set yourself out, right? It's like if you have a business, it's a way to set the business apart so you have a market share. But in terms of like the marketplace of ideas, right? It's a very male-dominated strategy, because um, between the two strategies of like play it safe and just make sure you have what's already accessible to you, or try to look out for new frontiers, the idea of being a contrarian is very much try to discover a new frontier so you can get big upside. So you have something proprietary. But to bring it back more to applied philosophy, it's not even so much disregard for social pressure, but regard for what is perceived as the opposite of social pressure. But is it really? Because, in fact, you might find that in a lot of cases, there's kind of a double negative, right? You might think, oh, this is just a majority opinion because it's obvious. But in the back of your head, you also kind of think, well, I'm kind of smarter than everyone because so many people disagree with me about this. But then in the back of your head, you also kind of know that your social group is kind of, or people you know, or people you respect, I should say, are kind of, you're influenced by them. So it's not really, I mean, you might have social pressure, but the social pressure doesn't affect you. The salient social effect is that people you respect happen to hold a view, and that's like the real social pressure. So to the extent that like you want to say social pressure doesn't affect me, it's mostly a mirage. Now the fourth thing, and this I'll get into it more on the next slide, but it's some suspension of emotional attachment as to entertain counterarguments. So essentially, this is the idea that um, you can think more clearly if you do not have your ego embedded in the belief. You just care about what's true or false. You don't care about, oh, this is true because it makes me look good, or this is false because it makes me look bad. You don't get too overly emotional. You keep like kind of a artificial detachment, like devil's argument attachment, where you can kind of entertain any idea and not have any strong emotional reaction. So it's kind of the reasonable man trope. However, I do think that this changed when, is his name Alex? He transitioned from content about atheism to content about veganism. And this is there are quite complicated reasons for this. Go on his channel and look up some videos where he discusses veganism really passionately. And what you will find in those videos is it does not seem like someone who's just completely emotionally detached, as in he has no stake in the game. In fact, he has kind of righteous indignation. There's the idea that, yes, I'm right about this, and in fact, if you disagree with me, you're immoral. And so you can see in some of his latest videos a genuine frustration. He's genuinely annoyed and just tired, and he's like, why do people still perpetuate this evil of eating animal products? It's a genuine annoyance, a genuine frustration. So what the change is from the reasonable man trope to a ferventness, that is commitment to or investment in some almost ritualistic renouncement of something. And I think in the case of veganism, it's pretty clear to see what that renouncement is. The renouncement is of animal products. So it is an actual prescription about how you should behave, which kind of follows if you believe that philosophy should be applied, then of course it should be applied to, what you are or are not allowed to eat, for example. And so, but also, you're contrarian and you have interrogative precepts, so you believe that your beliefs aren't just something passed down from tradition to tradition. If you have interrogative precepts, you don't believe that your actions are just some effect of cultural lineage, or they just happen to come along with your ethnicity. No, if you have interrogative precepts, you essentially think that your beliefs are grounded from first principles, that they have some baggage, that they are in some sense objectively true. And so you are right to condemn people who disagree with you about that, because if your beliefs are objectively true, well, it doesn't matter if a whole bunch of people disagree with them. You should evangelize to those people and spread your views to say, okay, here's why all of you need to change, because I'm objectively right about this. And in some sense, you're right to exactly do that. Now, I want to talk about why veganism would make this change, because veganism does tell you you should take this certain action, you should not eat meat. However, doesn't atheism also kind of tell you don't do certain things? Atheism tells you don't, follow God, don't believe in God. But I want to impress on you that that's kind of a moot point, because religion itself is something that demands ferventness. It's something that demands you do this and that and this and that. Follow the 10 Commandments. Don't, work on Sunday. Don't do this, don't do that. It has a bunch of prescriptions of things to avoid. So to renounce that is just a double negative. It's just to renounce renouncement. So in a sense, who cares? You can be an atheist and it will basically not affect your life in terms of what you were doing before you were an atheist and what you're doing after, other than now you're freer. Now you can do more. You have freedom to do more stuff that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. Of course, it doesn't so much affect a lot of the atheists I mentioned on my first slide because they'd never really believed in religion to begin with. So, being a passionate atheist, it's just a kind of way to say, yes, I'm right to be doing what I'm doing. Now, the thesis of the video. Basically, the 4 things that I've laid out so far are all found within Protestantism. And in fact, so much found within Protestantism that I would describe them as, if anything, the defining features of Protestantism, even before belief in God is a defining feature in Protestantism. And that's kind of a bold claim, but I will go over it later. First, let me go over each of these 4 items. Interrogative Precepts. This is the idea that if you should find out what is true about God by reading the Bible and introspecting and praying and meditating and finding it out yourself, and not through listening to the church like Catholics do. So Protestantism very much separates itself from Catholicism in this way. Or Catholicism says, oh, trust the priests. Protestantism says, no, trust yourself as long as you have the commitment it takes to look into the Bible and discover the facts of the reality. And this is, I think, one aspect of why Protestants are so well educated. If you look at some of the Protestant countries today, or countries where most people are descendant from Protestants, you'll find that education levels are some of the highest. Besides, like some of the Asian countries might have better test scores. But if you compare just Protestant countries to Catholic countries, then the Protestant countries are very exaggerated in the effect where you care a lot about the sciences, care about a lot about education, care a lot about that type of stuff. Applied philosophy. So applied philosophy is a bit different than Eastern spiritualism because Eastern spiritualism, some traditions like Buddhism, it feels a lot more like mental masturbation. Like even if you talk to some people who would passionately describe themselves as atheists, but if they're being honest, they were heavily, influenced by Eastern traditions. Maybe they even lived in India for a time, listened to gurus or highly spiritual people, and listened to them talk about how they see the world a totally different way because they went on an MDMA trip or they meditated for long periods of time and that sort of thing. It feels like it might connect with reality in some ephemeral way, and they will insist that it really does affect how they live their lives, how they see the world. But that's just the thing. It affects how they see the world. It doesn't affect, you don't try to deduce certain moral axioms or certain precepts or, maxims about you should do this or you should do that. And you don't try to deduce certain, moral principles is euthanasia good or bad? Through meditating on it really hard in Eastern traditions. It's introspective, yes, just like Protestantism, but it's not so much. It feels like, oh, let's obtain enlightenment. Let's see the world a different way. It's more ephemeral. Contrarianism. So it goes without saying, contrarianism is unlike a lot of religions. In fact, unlike the vast majority of religions, which in some capacity rely on social pressure to you should behave like people in your community. Like Islam, for example. In Islam, you can imagine that there's a lot of social pressure to pray to Mecca because everyone, there's a lot of pressure in the community. Why do you have to wear the hijab? There's a lot of pressure to do it. And if you happen to already believe the obscure theory that some strands of leftism are descendant from Protestantism, or they're just the people who are now, to make a softer statement, the people who are now very progressive, many of them are descended from Protestants and not Catholics? Well, it kind of makes sense, right? Because um, the whole progressive or leftist mindset, it does, at least in the present day, try to think of itself like we're fighting these oppressors, we're fighting the system, we're fighting society. Even if they become the system, even if they have a lot of power, they still try to hold on to this kind of myth that they're the underdogs. They want to feel like they're the contrarians. Last, ferventness. So in ferventness, the interesting thing about that is that there's a conflict somewhat between being questioning versus having a lot of conviction. If you're really questioning, then you want to second guess everything you believe just to make sure it's true, just to introspect on it more, just to interrogate it more and more. But however, if you have a lot of conviction, then no, you're sure that what you believe is right. So I guess the system is first you have to really interrogate something, and through that you can kind of validify it. And then when it's validified, you can hold it up and say, look, I've interrogated so much. Isn't it so much more true and obvious and objectively the case than all those beliefs that people who haven't interrogated their beliefs as much, they just haven't thought about their beliefs. So how can they even say their beliefs are correct if they haven't thought that much about why they're correct? And they would never accept as an argument, well, it's tradition, well, other people do it. No, if they haven't interrogated that, how can they say it's correct? But there is a conflict nonetheless between the ferventness and the conviction. So how is this different than any other religion? Well, let me compare Protestantism to Judaism, right? In Judaism, there is a lot of focus on like studies on using logic in interrogative precepts. However, I feel like the ferventness is more insular. The ferventness is, okay, it lets us in our own communities be fervent and practice, but that applies to ourselves. It's not about evangelizing to other people. Maybe you could say they don't just have the resources to evangelize to other people. They're not a big enough minority they can carry that out. But I don't buy it. I don't buy it because if, let's say you look at Christian missionaries, even when they're the single only Christian in the entire country, they will still try their hardest to convert people. So Protestantism is very much, okay, I have these things. I just found out that all you guys are being so immoral because I found out the objective moral truth that because I just read the Bible or I studied philosophy, and I discovered you're being moral. So I need to save you. Otherwise, you're just going to keep doing these bad things. But Jewishness, for example, it's more like, oh, I don't really care like what other people do as long as I have the freedom to do what we do. Now, I said before that Protestantism is more defined by its habits and its mindset than by its actual beliefs. Naming specifically the belief in God. Because if you think about it, well, let's say you follow each of these four precepts, right? These four items of Protestantism. By the way, I'm not like a scholar of Protestantism. It's hard for me to pronounce that word. It's late at night. Anyway, I should give that disclaimer. Perhaps should give it up front that I'm not like a scholar of these issues. These are just things that I've been able to observe through studying and learning about these topics. The thing is, if you follow these four items, then it's only a matter of time before you reject the old traditions, you reject X, Y, Z, and you follow new traditions, and eventually one thing to go is God. It's only a matter of time before you reject God too. And so Protestantism is in the weird state where the thing that theoretically defines Christianity, the belief in God, well, eventually can't it just evolve to a point where you lose that belief as well, and you have these old customs, you have these old like habits and temperamental things, but you ditched all of your old beliefs because you interrogated them too hard. You even ditched belief in God. And so this is why I think that rationality rules is basically the most Protestant person that I have ever seen. The most Protestant public figure, you could say, that I have observed online. I think each of the things that make people in Protestant countries different or have exaggerated features compared to their neighbors. Um, each person has exaggerated features. Like Catholics have exaggerated Catholic features. Muslims, maybe they have exaggerated Muslim features. Um, but Protestants, they have exaggerated Protestant features. What are they? Well, I think you can find them most strongly in someone like rationality rules. I did say that, so basically, there are two ways to think about defining an ideology. The first is through its temperament and the practices and the way it goes about things, and the second is its beliefs or dogma. And I said that I was going to circle back to why I'm talking about rationality rules in terms of what his temperament is and not what his beliefs are. Because I would argue that the point of discussing that is in some ways, when we go about classifying ideologies or religions, it's just as important, if not more important, to define them based on the customs. But in the way people describe what they believe, it's the exact opposite. When you ask people, okay, what do you believe? What is your religion? Let's say you ask a Catholic, okay, why are you a Catholic? They'll give you the example, oh, I believe in the Nicene Creed. I believe in Jesus. I believe in all of the things that Catholics believe. I believe in the communion. And this makes sense because you asked a question about what do you believe, but you didn't ask the question, what do you do? But the question, what do you do, is just as prescient. And why should we define religions just based on what they believe? And maybe that's kind of the atheist way of thinking about religions. But in fact, what's more prescient for religions is what they do. Think, for example, Catholic marriage traditions. There are lots of people, I should say Christian marriage traditions is more accurate. Almost all people in Western countries, let me back up. People in Western countries, at this stage, many of them would not describe themselves as Christian. However, almost all of them, in some sense, follow Catholic marriage traditions, even if they don't think they do. So, to go about proving this, let me make a, checklist of what I would define as being a part of Catholic marriage traditions. So, marriage is just one example. So, what makes the marriage? I would define it as monogamy in the context of marriage, cohabitation, asset sharing, and sharing of child rearing, and the also certain prohibitions, like, of course, no polygamy, but also no incest, no cousin marriages. You could say that monogamy has gone out the wayside because now, after we have contraception, people have kind of abandoned it because now most people in the West, they have more than one sexual partner over their lives. They may have many sexual partners over their lives. And so if you go by the old model, you should only have one sexual partner your whole life. Well, that's gone. However, it's not completely gone because it is still the case that in the context of marriage, there's an enormous stigma against cheating on your partner, right? You should only be monogamous in the context. You should be monogamous in that context. But this was not always the case in all marriage customs all over the world. There are many cultures, some Islamic places, some, all sorts of religions that hold to different customs, and polygamy is common. I want to stress the most the point about cousin marriages. Before certain policies instituted by the Catholic Church, cousin marriages were common, but Catholic Church instituted a ban on cousin marriages, perhaps for political reasons, to break up the large families, to break up the politically powerful factions and the family customs. Like, you needed to do that, so you changed the marriage customs. But in doing so, you fundamentally changed the breeding operations for an entire continent. You fundamentally formed just a whole genetic issue about how babies are made, how people pair a partner, how people find mates. It has a huge impact on the culture of the society, and you can see differences, for example, between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. In Western Europe, they hold much more tightly, or have historically, and you can still see ramifications of this, to the fact that they're less clannish. They're more likely to marry outside of their clan. So you can measure like the marriage distance. So do you marry your cousin, your second cousin, your third cousin? And this makes a huge impact. And my point is, people in Western countries, many of them would not say they're Catholic, would not say they're Christian. However, how many of them follow the cousin marriage tradition, or rather, ban on it? And they would say, well, that doesn't make me a Christian. That's just a rational thing to do. However, you just take that for granted. It's only the case because the Catholic Church instituted it. And if they had not instituted that policy, who knows if we would be doing that? And so you are descended from people who did that, or you were influenced by people who were descended from people who did that. And so that's the reason you did that. Or you came from like another culture which also had a ban on cousin marriages. But there are many cultures that do that. There are many cultures that don't do that. Christianity, it's likely that if you live in the West, that the reason you don't do that is because you're from a culture that doesn't do that because of the Catholic Church. And so they would say, oh, I'm not a Christian because I don't believe in God. However, they're still in some sense a Christian culturally. They just don't know it. Because if you hold to all these Christian customs, well, I mean, in some sense, objectively, you just are a Christian. And they might try to refute that. They might try to argue and say, well, no, that's not a Christian thing. That's just a rational thing to do. Of course you shouldn't marry your cousin. It has all these bad ramifications, genetic problems, diseases. I don't need to be a Christian to do that. I can just be convinced to do that on the virtue that it's a good idea. However, that's not a good refutation. The fact that something is a good policy does not make it any less a belief of a religion. A religion is just very, very much capable of having beliefs or policies that are good. And you might not assume that if you're an atheist, but it's perfectly possible that a policy is both correct and also just a descriptor of the religion. And that you, by meeting that descriptor, can be said to fulfill one aspect of the religion. And in some sense, if you meet enough checkboxes, then yeah, you're in some sense culturally that religion. And so I think that the fact that we define religions purely on beliefs, it's part of the aspect to this, but religious people perpetrate it just as much as the atheists, because the religious people, they choose to define themselves that way based on their beliefs. They choose to give more credence to it. But that's what I'm challenging here. So, one last point to this effect. Let's say that you have a Jew who follows to a T a bunch of Jewish traditions, like he has a bat mitzvah. He follows a few Jewish traditions. However, he does not even believe in God. He does not really believe in any parts of the scripture or any stuff like that. Is he still a Jew? Well, according to society, most people would say yes. Many people would say no. Many Jews would say no. But a lot of just casual people would say, oh yeah, he's still a Jew. He follows the traditions. And that's what I mean. It just happens to be different for Christians, perhaps because of the evangelical, the thing I described above, where it's the ferventness, the fact that you have to take your beliefs and convince other people of them, that forces Christians to emphasize that aspect of their faith. Now, there's one last thing I want to talk about, and that is, I have kind of tried to neutrally describe each of these points, Protestantism versus Catholicism. I tried to neutrally compare Catholicism to Protestantism, but and that by the way is the first point, the point about interrogative precepts. And when I did that, you might think, okay, it's fair and good to do that, but isn't it just obviously correct that it's better to have interrogative precepts? If you believe something, obviously you should have a good reason for believing it. How can it be otherwise? How can you believe something and like not know why. Many people do that, but isn't that a failure of them? If they were good people, if they were like academics, or they seriously cared, they should try to know the reason. And it's just a mark of laziness. In effect, it's a mark of weakness of character that they believe stuff, but they don't even know why. But what I want, the last thing I want to describe in this video and really impress on you is just one argument for defending the idea that you might want to follow something because it's tradition, or follow something because it's some institution like the Catholic Church that's been around for a long time tells you to do. I personally don't really like. I like to know why I believe what I believe, but I want to defend why people would do otherwise. And to do so, I want to take a page from biology. In biology, there's this concept of symbiosis and the different levels of symbiosis. So the first is mutualism. So mutualism is a type of symbiosis. Species A benefits and species B benefits. So they both help each other. An idea is shown in this image. Commensalism, species A benefits, species B benefits. You can read the image. Parasitism. Now that's a difference. Parasitism is only one species benefits. In effect, it's like living off the other and harming it. It's like a tapeworm, right? So why is it that organisms evolve to be parasites? And why is it that organisms evolve to be non-parasites or even symbiotic, like humans and dogs, for example? Well, if we look at the history of their evolution, I think one clue is horizontal spread versus vertical spread. Horizontal spread means you spread from peer to peer. Like, I have the disease, and then I cough, and I spread the disease to my coworker, and my coworker coughs, and he spreads the disease to the lady down the street, and the lady down the street takes the plane to another country and spreads the disease to someone with another country, that other country might be completely different from my country, but the disease doesn't care. It's spreading horizontally. The second option is vertical spreading. Vertical spreading is spreading from parent to child. It's passing on generation to generation. And so I gave examples. An example of horizontal spreading is fungus. An example of vertical spreading is eukaryotes binding with prokaryotes. At this point, you can't separate them. Eukaryotes and prokaryotes, the whole breeding process of how cells replicate, it replicates both. So in order for the parasite, quote unquote, to have any chance of survival, it has to ensure that its host is also successful. In fact, the degree to which the host is successful, the more its host is successful, it just benefits itself because it's getting the energy from the host, and the only way it can have kids, the only way it can spread, the only way it can replicate as a replicator is by just benefiting the host as much as possible. So it's in its interest, in that case, to live in symbiosis. However, if you spread horizontally, then it's not necessarily in your interest to benefit the host, because you don't care if the host dies eventually, as long as by the time the host dies, you've spread. Because the way that you spread is, peer-to-peer, so you don't care if the host dies. So it's a question of incentives, and I think this way of thinking about biology is very interesting to me, because it's like a linkage between economics and biology. So economics is kind of something I'm interested in, something I've studied in university. And the thing is, economics is all about incentives. So insofar as biology relates to incentives, it's interesting to me. Some people take issue to that way of describing it because they say, like, living things don't respond to incentives. Evolution doesn't know to do that. But, like, it's ultimately a semantics distinction. Living things behave evolutionarily like they respond to incentives. It's not so much like incentive implies you tell the person, okay, if you do this, I'm going to give you a cherry, or I'm going to give you a present if you do this. So it's like telling them a motivator. And of course, evolution isn't motivated in the same way, but like it sort of is, right? Because it's not motivated like consciously. However, the selective mechanism, it picks things that behave as though they are motivated. So like the semantic space around talking about how evolution works, it's not very well. Um, it can be, some people can be needlessly anal about this and just make conversation difficult by saying, well, don't you know evolution isn't a conscious process? Well, yeah, I never said it was. I just said like the organisms that are going to pass on their genes are the ones that are able to um, respond to what is best for their survival. And so, what is best for their survival, if they go that route, is ultimately like they're following where the resources are, they're following where the opportunities are, and that's not that much difference in practice than just responding to incentives. That was a long sidetracked rant, but you get my point that incentives play a huge role, and in spread from peer to peer, that is, you infect a different host that has no like parental relationship between the last host you infected. That has one set of incentives. However, infecting a host that does have a parental relationship between the last host you infected, that whole has a whole different set of relationship. Now, the atheist Richard Dawkins is famous for this idea of the meme. So, in order to understand a meme, you have to understand that there's evolution at the biological layer, but there's also evolution at a whole separate layer. There's evolution at the cultural layer, and this is evolution of cultural items. What is a cultural item? It's these human constructs, these social constructs. For example, a word. A word is something humans make up, and they use it to the extent it's useful to use that word. But a word also is sort of subject to Darwinian pressures. If a word ceases to be useful, it ceases to be fit, then it will be no longer used. However, if a word, let's say there's more opportunities to use it, it finds itself in more situations like there's a new invention and the new invention becomes more popular. Now it's more fit, now there's more incentive to use it, so it grows. And so words can come and die, and also words can change. Words are subject to just natural evolution. We even use this word as linguists. If you talk about it, you talk about language evolution. It is literally evolution. Languages evolve, and also words evolve as subcomponents of the language. So there's a whole bunch of different levels of abstraction to this. And even something like a corporation. Like corporations, they can die, they can survive if they are strong enough, but if they're not fit enough, they die. And so kind of it's sort of analogous to evolution, although there it's less similar to evolution, but it's still, there are similarities. But something like a word, it's definitely analogous to evolution. So what about institutions? What about cultural beliefs? What about aspects of cultural temperament? What about habitual cultural practices? Things like language is just the tip of the iceberg of culture. Really, culture is a whole bunch of things that are a lot more ephemeral, a lot more difficult to define. But these two, I believe, if you believe the meme theory of evolution that culture evolves too, then these two are subject to evolution. It's kind of ironic that this theory was proposed by Richard Dawkins, but ultimately, this theory, so crazily atheist in its origins, ultimately leads back to the utility of religion, because religion is a cultural thing, it's a cultural institution. And so, one way of thinking about it is that this cultural institution, this meme, this religion, I'm not talking about whether or not this is, I'm not talking theology here. I'm not discussing whether or not which religion is true or not true. I'm talking purely about the utility of certain beliefs. And in that sense, in the sense of utility of certain beliefs, we can talk about the host is the humans. The host is the culture. The host is society. The host is the believer of the religion. The religion is the parasite, or that's a strong word. It's not the parasite. It's the other organism living in symbiosis. Okay, So there's a symbiosis between the cultural thing, the meme that wants to spread by Darwinian means, versus the person who wants to spread their literal genes by Darwinian means. Okay, so the next relevant question to ask is it a symbiotic relationship or is it a parasitic relationship? And then the next question you might want to ask is, well, is it a religion that spreads horizontally, or is it a religion that spreads vertically? That's interesting. And vertical spread is passing the religion on from parent to child. Parents taking their children to church, their kids believe something because it's part of the tradition, because that they believe it because the church teaches it, because they've taught it for thousands of years, and it's worked. And we know it's worked because churches have survived and have survived the Darwinian test, and there are millions of Christians, and they're alive today. And isn't it so strange that they believe this thing that carries with it the demands to a lot of sacrifice? It demands sacrifice, but it's still alive. What does that tell you? Maybe it serves some utility, some Darwinian utility. It has helped out the host organism. That's a justification for believing in tradition, even if my personal temperament might not like it. And so I probably, I'm going to be honest, don't really, I want to believe in myself from first principles, the justification for everything I believe, but I'm not going to judge anyone who does otherwise. So, where do we go from here? Is our society just so fundamentally different now, post-industrial revolution, post all these new technologies, that tradition just no longer applies, it's outdated, it hasn't moved fast enough? Well, people have made that argument. But I will leave you with just two things. If you want some work to do, if this video has inspired you, you might want to look up Chesterton's fence or the precautionary principle. And I believe that the path forward is a lot of humbleness, a lot of interrogative presupposition, a lot of interrogating our beliefs. However, although that is a big part of science, science is about interrogating your beliefs. Ultimately, there are a lot of things that science will have not quick answers to. Science will not be able to answer quickly. And with respect to those beliefs, well, the right approach is some combination of Chesterton's fence and the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle, as I define it, as if there is irreversible damage, then the burden is on the people who want to adopt that policy which will create that potential damage. It's a question of upside versus capping the downside. It's a question of whether the change you want to implement, we can go back on it if we later discover it's a wrong belief, or whether it's irreversible. So, it ultimately rests on irreversibility.